Thank you everybody for joining us and welcome to our webinar. My name is Richard King with the BC Forest Safety Council, and I am very pleased to present our topic today of mitigation strategies for wildfire smoke and other respiratory hazards in wildland firefighting. First off, I'd like to acknowledge that I am broadcasting from the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Snuneymuxw First Nation. So, Steve and Drew, thank you very much for being with us today. I am very excited to hear what you have to say. I know that smoke and fire and air quality are at the top of many people's minds, especially in the forest industry and especially as we come into fire season. I know that we've already seen some activity this year so far, and we'll continue to deal with that throughout the summer. So we're very interested to see what you and the BC Wildfire Service and partners are doing to improve the safety of your workers. So Steve, if it's okay with you, I will turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Lemon. I am the Safety and Wellbeing Officer for British Columbia Wildfire Service. I come to this position from a great deal of fire line experience. I've been on just about every type of response crew within BC Wildfire. I'm also a Type 1 incident commander and spend a good amount of my time in the fire environment. And this topic around respiratory health has been sort of a focal point for us for the last probably 7 years now. And what we're going to present today is kind of a culmination of where we're at with that experience. So going back even as far as 2017, 2018, we had a number of our workers engaged in a study from the University of Alberta, just looking at smoke exposures in our staff. Following that, we were able to create partnerships with the University of Alberta and the University of Northern British Columbia to do some specific research on firefighters, on smoke exposures, the type of work that contributes more to smoke and ash exposures. We've also done research into polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and how they can be ingested into the system, both through the respiratory system as well as through the dermal system, so through skin absorption. The research kind of got a little bit interrupted during the COVID era, as these things kind of all did, but we were able to sort of get the first forum, I guess, from the University of Alberta out in 21. And then following that, we engaged with Drew here, who will tell us about himself in a minute. You know, as a hygienist within BC Wildfire, as a student, as a co-op student, and now he's moved on to a different role. So really, just the point being is we've spent quite a bit of time doing research. You know, some of which really is brand new, hasn't been completed in other fire agencies before, and really the era of understanding is changing. And so partly due to the research we've conducted, partly due to other just research becoming more available to us, we can no longer kind of put our head in the sand and say that, you know, well, it's just trees, it's just smoke, you know, it doesn't impact us. Like that used to be our sort of guiding principle, is that as long as we weren't being exposed to non-veg smoke, we were fine. It's natural, it's part of the environment. And we've really changed our thinking on that and really trying to do what's best for our workers. So I'll let Drew take it. I'll let Drew introduce himself and kind of take it away from there, and I'll be here to answer any questions as they come up if related to BC Wildfire Service.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Super excited to present on some of the work that we've been doing regarding wildfire smoke and other respiratory hazards. As Steve mentioned, I came onto the scene at BC Wildfire Service first in a co-op student role through my master's program at UBC. And that was somewhat late in the game. BC Wildfire Service has been engaged in looking at respiratory health and conducting research since 2017. And my role now, through a partnership with Canada Wildfire, where my position currently lays, is to help facilitate connections with academic institutions, as well as to go onto the fire line and conduct exposure assessments that look at how much our staff are exposed to wildfire smoke and to other hazards, and try to bridge the gap between what we're finding in research and how we're operationalizing these a bit with health and safety programming. So I work within the research and innovation business area at BC Wildfire Service, sort of similar to an in-house consultant-ish role, as I work actually within Canada Wildfire. And just as a brief introduction to the research and innovation business area, it's a 5 to 7-ish person team, depending on the day. There's some temporary hires and whatnot, but around 5 to 7 people. It was established in 2018 to strengthen and modernize the organization's approach to fighting fire. And they by no means focus specifically on health and wellness. As you can see, there's a bunch of different domains where they conduct research in, but a large priority has been on the health and wellness work, and that's where a lot of my expertise and a lot of my efforts lay. So a bit of an agenda for this presentation. We'll start by doing a very brief overview of the wildland fire environment. We will look at what the exposures of concerns are and how wildland firefighters may be exposed. We'll look at what the research says regarding these exposure levels compared to exposure limits to sort of provide context to just how bad is it or how not bad is it. And then we will spend about half the presentation looking at ways in which BC Wildfire is looking to control exposure, what current projects are underway, what's been done, and what some plans are for the future. And then I'll also spend a few slides looking at how the forestry industry at large can start to think about controlling exposure for their workers, and looking at sort of best practices and what other jurisdictions are doing for a little bit of guidance. So the wildland firefighting work environment can broadly be described into 2 categories. You have the fire camp and the fire line. The fire camp is often somewhat remote with limited facilities. There'll be trailers for showers and bathrooms and things like that, but far less facilities than a more permanent traditional workplace would have. This is where staff rest, eat, sleep, and work. And depending on location and environmental characteristics, the fire camp can itself be a source of exposure to ambient wildfire smoke, which can be a significant concern for staff who spend 24/7 sleeping here and working here, and also fireline staff who come back here to rest and ideally get away from the exposures on the fire line, only to be met with more smoke. On the fire line itself, it's extremely remote. In certain situations, you may have to drive for up to 2 hours. You may need to hike for an hour. You may need to take a helicopter to get there. There are pretty much no facilities in terms of ability to wash yourself or decontaminate. You can be exposed to that broad ambient wildfire smoke, as you can see in that bottom left picture there, particularly under certain inversion conditions where essentially a cold layer of air is trapped close to the surface of the ground, and all of the wildfire smoke in that air is trapped, and there's no mixing, and it can actually move throughout the atmosphere. However, importantly, on the fire line, of course, there's also point sources of wildfire smoke. So you can see in that picture on the top left there's an individual wet mopping a hot spot. So that's a spot of smoldering coal, and they're using a hose to completely saturate it with water. So they can be exposed much more on a much higher level when they're actioning these specific spots of wildfire smoke and coals. And it's not just smoke. The wildland fire line is an incredibly ashy and dusty place, and there's a lot of exposure to the fumes of engine exhaust as they work very closely with chainsaws, water pumps, and even vehicle emissions as well. So I'll move on now to what wildland firefighters are exposed to, and sort of what are some situations and characteristics that impact how much they're exposed and how we think about their exposure. So I will describe a lot of these abbreviations in a few slides when I go into the individual hazards, but I wanted to spend a few slides to sort of broadly paint a picture of what the fire line looks like. And it can be an incredibly smoky place. You have individuals who are engaged in tasks that such as dry mopping. Here, if you can see my mouse in the top left there, where they use like a hand tool or if it's a wet mopping, a hose to extinguish hot coals. You have people lighting ignitions, which can expose them to significant smoke. And then you have, of course, that ambient smoke where entire geographic regions of the province are just exposed to the smoke. So it all kind of lays on top of each other and results in what can be quite significant smoke exposure. As I mentioned, though, it's also very ashy and very dusty, and I want to impress upon this audience the dangers that can be in just normal everyday dust from the soil. So what you can see in these pictures here, there are various photos of wildland firefighters hiking through what's very fine and dry ash and dust, and that makes it really easy to kick it up into the air and into the air that you breathe. And this can expose workers to crystalline silica, which is a mineral found in the Earth's crust. It can expose people to particulate matter, which they're already getting exposed to from wildfire smoke, and it can also expose staff to those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, those PAHs that Steve was mentioning, through their skin as they conduct, everyday routine tasks such as cold trailing, which requires someone to put their hand in an ash pit and feel around for heat before they can decide whether that pit's been sufficiently put out or not. And then with engine exhaust, you're looking at much of the same hazards that we see in wildfire smoke: particulate matter, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and volatile organic compounds. And I will kind of describe all of these different exposures. But the big thing to note is, yes, wildland firefighters work quite heavily with different small combustion engines, and a lot of the exposures are overlapping with wildfire smoke. So looking at the specific hazards, we'll start with particulate matter in wildfire smoke. Largely, that's kind of the most abundant pollutant and one of the biggest concerns as it relates to occupational disease. And wildfire smoke, like any other form of air pollution, whether this comes from vehicle emissions or like factory emissions, expose the individual to very, very fine particulate matter. You might have seen or heard of the term PM 2.5, which is particulate matter with a diameter of 2.5 microns. And what's really dangerous about particulate matter this small is that when you inhale it, it goes to the very deepest sections of your lung, where it can stay for years, if not permanently. It can evade any sort of clearance mechanisms. You can't cough it up, and it causes local damage to your lungs. Additionally, when particles are very small, like wildfire particles, which are less than 1 micron generally, they are amongst the smallest particles out of any sort of form of air pollution. When they get into your lungs, they can actually translocate into your blood. And once they're in your blood, these particles can go essentially anywhere in your body, from your liver to your kidneys to your heart or your brain, and they become a systemic toxicant at that point. So I have some pictures here just showing what these particulates actually look like. We have incredibly small balls of soot and tar, and then larger, irregular, jagged fragments of char and ash as well. And then the picture on the left there is one that we took last year while we were looking at different respiratory protection, and that was the filter, particulate filter of a respirator after just a few hours of somebody engaged in hot spotting on the fire line. So you can definitely see all of that would have been breathed in by the individual. And just this last point here, as Steve kind of alluded to, there's a lot of individuals may think that wildfire smoke is natural and therefore it might not be so unhealthy, but in fact, there's no evidence to suggest it's any less healthy than any other form of air pollution that you could be exposed to. And in fact, there is some evidence to suggest that it may even be more toxic than other forms, more traditional forms of air pollution. So one of the other major components of wildfire smoke is carbon monoxide, which is not a particulate, it's a gas, which are kind of like the two ways that air pollution can form in the air or can be present in the air. And carbon monoxide is an invisible and odorless gas. It's found in wildfire smoke and in engine exhaust. It's a byproduct of combustion. And when we think about carbon monoxide exposure on the fire line, there's kind of two ways we look at it. So first, there is this kind of chronic low to moderate exposure of about 5 to 10 parts per million. And this can result from just ambient smoke, like in that bottom left picture, or use associated with a chainsaw. And this can result in a lot of symptoms that overlap with like heat stress and fatigue and dehydration. Generally, you're more fatigued, you have reduced exercise tolerant, headache, and nausea, things like that. And then we also have situations on the fire line that can expose the worker to very high levels of carbon monoxide on a much shorter term, I think anywhere from 1 to 15 minutes. And this can be, 3, 4, 500 or more parts per million of carbon monoxide. And in that situation, because carbon monoxide kind of acts on the body so readily, you can see symptoms, within seconds or minutes. And these symptoms at these levels can be, confusion, cognitive impairment, extreme dizziness, and then ultimately collapse, permanent brain injury, and death if the individual remains in that atmosphere, say they collapse and they were never removed. So carbon monoxide It's much less a concern as we think of the other hazards causing occupational disease. We are more concerned with the immediate symptoms that can pose a safety risk on the fire line when we think about carbon monoxide. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, is a suite of compounds that we've done quite a bit of research with. They are a class of compounds released during combustion, and they exist in the air as both of those phases of particles and gases. And there's 100 or more PAHs, and they are a mixture of confirmed, suspected, or unknown carcinogens. And what's unique about PAHs is that they can be absorbed through the regular pathway, inhalation. You can also ingest them, but they can be absorbed through the skin. And this is really important from a wildland firefighting perspective because as a normal task, they are exposed to ash and soot all over their skin on a day-to-day basis. And we now know that this ash and the soot is being absorbed into their blood, just like if they were inhaling smoke. And in other occupations, exposure to PAHs is associated with an increased risk of lung, skin, and bladder cancers. Crystalline silica is also unique in that it doesn't arise from combustion. It has nothing to do per se with wildfire smoke, and it can be present in the air anytime you disturb soil. So many industries in the forestry industry could be exposed to crystalline silica as well. There's a good rule of thumb out there where essentially if you can see a cloud of dust at that moment, you are likely overexposed to silica. And you can see in these pictures, these tasks are incredibly dusty. And this video that's playing on the screen, I took that in 2022, and this crew was just doing this one task for an entire day. And silica is so dangerous, and it's such a strictly controlled hazard in BC and in all of Canada. And construction industries, mining industries all go through very great pains. A lot of time and money is spent on controlling silica dust exposure because when you inhale it, it goes deep into your lungs and it causes scarring. And it slowly over time, as you chronically are exposed, it turns healthy elastic lung tissue into fibrotic inelastic lung tissue and causes a permanent irreversible disease called silicosis that's very debilitating. And it's also a lung carcinogen as well. And then volatile organic compounds, these are essentially the gaseous component of wildfire smoke. And some of the major ones we're concerned about are formaldehyde, which is an irritant and can cause upper respiratory tract cancer of the nose and throat, acrolein, which is also an irritant and can cause pulmonary damage, and then benzene, which can cause headache and dizziness, and then leukemia as well. So those are the main components we're concerned about when it comes to respiratory hazards, but there's some other considerations to take into account, and a lot of them are probably quite applicable to the forestry industry as well. So, and this begins with shift length adjustments. Any exposure limit is predicated on an 8-hour workday, and it assumes that you're exposed for 8 hours, you go home, you rest away from the exposure for 16 hours, and that offsets your total 24-hour dose of exposure. However, in wildland firefighting and any workplace where shift lengths aren't a traditional 8 hours, this can actually go as far as to be completely flipped, where firefighters are working for 16 hours and they only get to rest away from the exposure for 8 hours. Now, I put air quotes around rest away from the exposure because it's certainly possible that when they go to the fire camp, or they even go home if they're fighting fires near their home, they can be exposed to wildfire smoke during those 8 hours or however many hours away from the fire line. And this can result in just periods of 24/7 exposure to wildfire smoke and all of the compounds within it with no way to rest away from the exposure. Another consideration is the breathing rate. So just like how a normal or a typical OEL assumes an 8-hour workday, it also assumes that you're a sedentary worker and you breathe in about 10 cubic meters of air in 8 hours. We know that wildland firefighters are breathing at much higher rates, anywhere from about 24 to 60 liters a minute. So that can be up to 3 times as much as a sedentary worker. And while we talk about exposures and we measure exposures and concentrations in the air, what we're really concerned about is the internal dose. And if you're breathing 3 times as heavy as a sedentary worker, you're inhaling 3 times as much of the hazard. And then on top of this, wildland firefighters typically, or not typically, but may often work at high altitudes, which increase the breathing rate and thus the internal dose of some contaminants. Dermal contamination, which we've talked a little bit about, is another huge factor because even if you can control inhalation hazards, you're still going to be absorbing those PAHs through your skin, which is a definite concern. You can also get re-exposed to PAHs from interacting with contaminated PPE and surfaces such as the interior of truck cabs. This has been shown in structural firefighting, and it's likely occurring in wildland firefighting. There's just been no real research into it to validate that. And then additionally, due to shift lengths and the constraints of camp facilities, wildland firefighters may not be getting adequately supported to effectively decontaminate, ideally doing full showers every day, having a clean pair of Nomex and clean PPE at the start of every day, etc. And then the last kind of aspect around exposure that I want to talk about is culture. And the culture in wildland firefighting is definitely lagging behind structural firefighting, where we've seen really great strides in the last few years or a decade or so, where firefighters are educated and trained on the hazards of smoke and soot. They are supported financially with the means and time to go through gross decontamination procedures the second they step out of fire scenes. They have fire halls that are being designed and built with the flow of decontaminated PPE in mind, all of these to reduce the amount of exposure, particularly through dermal exposures as well. In structural firefighting. And on the flip side, in wildland firefighting, you have a lot of individuals out there who they take pride in having soot-covered skin and blackened Nomex. And this can lead to, people stretching laundry as far as possible because they don't want to show up at the start of a day with a bright pair of reds and blues because it doesn't look as good as a dirty pair. Or in some extreme situations, you may have people just foregoing showering altogether. Part of this culture issue is also, as I mentioned before, this notion that wildfire smoke is not dangerous, or it's natural, or it's just part of the job and it's what people sign up for. Obviously, this is not true. We know that it's dangerous to your health, and we know that there are ways that we can reduce exposure. And then lastly, I'd like to just touch on this point of a pride in completing objectives. In a traditional workplace, as a health and safety professional implementing controls, you may be working against productivity and the profit motive and trying to advocate for the health and safety of workers. You don't really have that, at least not the profit motive drive when you're talking about wildland firefighting, but there is definitely an internal pride in being able to be productive and completing objectives, and this may cloud people's judgment and push limits beyond reasonable exposure as individuals and entire crews value very highly the amount of work that they can do, especially during situations where life and property is put at significant risk. So now I'll spend a few slides talking about what are the research currently says around exposure levels and how that's kind of guiding our risk assessments. So a brief note on exposure limits: they are the maximum allowed airborne concentration in a workplace for a given substance. They are not a fine line between healthy and unhealthy. You can be exposed under an exposure limit at a workplace and still develop symptoms or potentially a disease associated with that exposure. It is a limit that is put for practical means that's based on a lot of practicalities, what is achievable and what's not achievable. And it is a limit that we can say most workers are not likely to have ill health effects at this level of exposure. What we can do is we can monitor workplace air and judge it against an exposure limit to allow us to make risk assessment judgments. So if we went out and sampled 100 days and those days were 50% of the exposure limit versus 150% of the exposure limit, there's different things that we would want to do and different risk categories we would put those into. And then lastly, some workplace exposures, and many in wildland firefighting and wildfire smoke, are what WorkSafe BC calls a designated substance, which is so dangerous. For example, carcinogenic exposures fall under this, that we don't go by exposure limits, but we go by this principle of reducing exposures as low as reasonably achievable and trying to reduce them further and further and further. So I'll just take a minute to explain this small little table here because it'll show up on a few slides here. On the left column, we have the top 5% of exposures. This is all taken from the literature. In the middle column, we have the exposure limit. And then on the right column, we have the hazard ratio, which is the top 5% of exposures divided by the exposure limit. So here you can see for respirable particulate matter, the top 5% of exposures as indicated by literature is about 1,800 micrograms per meters cubed. The exposure limit we're working with here is 700 micrograms per meters cubed, and that results in a hazard ratio of 2.6 or 2.5% what the exposure limit is. This indicates a very ill-controlled hazard in an ill-controlled workplace. For context, the goal is not to get a hazard ratio to 1. You actually want to be far below 1 with a goal of getting it under 50%, which is called the action limit. And the tough thing with wildfire smoke and the particulate matter associated with it is that There is no wildfire smoke exposure limit. There's no PM 2.5 exposure limit. That just doesn't exist. And some wildfire organizations use a working OEL of 700 micrograms per meters cubed, which is what I've used in this table here, but it's not the most robust exposure limit, and it's not based in epidemiological or toxicological data, and it's quite high. It's much higher than the range of an AQI chart could go. Looking at the same kind of table for carbon monoxide, we can see the top 5% of exposures are 11 ppm compared to exposure limit of about 6.25 and a hazard ratio of 1.76. So again, we see in a workplace when we look at carbon monoxide, it's not well controlled, and so we'll likely can expect that workers are showing symptoms like fatigue, like nausea, like reduced exercise tolerance, headaches, etc., things like that. Generally, carbon monoxide is driven by engine exhaust. This is particularly true when it's not a very smoky fire line, but high exposure fire lines are common and can considerably exceed exposure limits. Crystalline silica, it's very concerning what the research says. There's been very little research into it. In fact, this data here is pulled from just one study, and it found that the top 5% of exposures were 19 times the exposure limit for silica, which is just extremely, extremely high. And this is going to be very dependent on what the individual is doing for that day, if they're engaged in tasks that are disturbing a lot of soil, or if they're not engaged in any tasks that are disturbing soil. But we do see that those kind of top 5%, 1 in 20 workers or 1 in 20 work days, you can expect incredibly high levels of silica exposure. When we think about volatile organic compounds, again, these are the gases in wildfire smoke. We're largely concerned with formaldehyde, which has a hazard ratio of over 3, and then benzene's kind of the next up there with a hazard ratio of just 0.3, so it's pretty well controlled there. There are many, many gases in wildfire smoke, and again, not all of them have exposure limits, so you can't do this kind of analyses, or not all of them have been evaluated, but out of the ones that are most abundantly been analyzed and present in high levels, we're really talking about formaldehyde. Okay, so what is BC Wildfire doing to assess and control exposures? So we'll go through a few of the research projects that we've engaged in over the last few years, some work that we're doing this summer as well, and then kind of maybe a projection for what the future could hold. So as Steve mentioned in the intro, we started at the Research and Innovation business area by working with researchers from University of Northern British Columbia to look at smoke exposure and respiratory health. And this finished in 2019, but it was conducted in the 2017 fire season. It involved 34 wildland firefighters and looked at their lung function and how it changed from pre-season to post-season. And what it saw was there was small, not statistically significant, but that does not mean that it's not an important effect, consistent declines in lung functions that were observed in all 3 crews across the season. And this is in line with broader academic research that's been done looking at lung function in wildland firefighters. We see modestly small but very consistent decreases in many different spirometry lung function measures. It's unknown to what extent these declines are going to persist between seasons. You have a period of intense exposure followed by a period of ostensibly no exposure or very little exposure, and so there's a possibility that they may balance out, and over years and years and years of wildland firefighting, you don't see consistent lung decrease functions or lung function decreases, but this hasn't been evaluated, and it's something that we are looking to evaluate in the future. In 2022, we conducted a carbon monoxide exposure assessment on the fire line and found that tasks associated with engine use were largely driving CO exposure, so sawyers and pump operators. These fire lines had relatively low fire exposure, and so that's why the engine exhaust was really what was driving it. For individuals who weren't using engines and would just be exposed to wildfire smoke, we were able to use the carbon monoxide readings to estimate smoke exposure, which is a fairly accurate and most easy and cheap way to assess exposure to particulate matter in wildfire smoke. And we found that on these particular fire lines, which again were quite low exposure fire lines, the levels of smoke exposure amounted to what the air quality index calls unhealthy. And what else we also found is that smoke exposure is highly variable, and it's dependent on fire line conditions. It can change dramatically between seasons, deployments, between days, and even hours within a day. And this can be incredibly difficult to anticipate ahead of time when we think about characterizing a workplace, when we think about trying to get out there and monitor all different conditions, from high conditions, low conditions, average conditions, etc. So it can be very tough to accurately characterize the wildland firefighting environment. We conducted a lot of research looking at polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, and for the sake of time, I will very briefly go over what was done. We partnered with researchers from the University of Alberta and industrial hygienists from Aura Health and Safety, who are based out of Burnaby, and we conducted a suite of research that evaluated exposure to PAHs, which again were those kind of class of carcinogenic compounds in wildfire smoke, ash, and soot. And we measured the pre-shift and post-shift urine of wildland firefighters, because it allows us to see how much, not only how much PAHs they're exposed to, but how much is actually getting absorbed in the body. And what this allows us to do is measure the effective mitigation strategies, namely respiratory protection use and enhanced skin hygiene. And broad strokes, what we found was we identified that wildland firefighters are exposed to PAHs in the air they breathe and through the skin absorption of soot. And in some cases, the level of PAHs in the body can exceed exposure limits. We also found that discretionary use of a respirator reduced PAH absorption, and enhanced skin hygiene may reduce absorption, but there was a bit of conflicting results. The enhanced skin hygiene was essentially just having the group that was allocated to the enhanced protocols change their Nomex and shower as quickly as possible after the fire line. So now I'm going to kind of switch gears a bit and just focus specifically on respiratory protection for a few slides. And I wanted to just provide a timeline here. So we just went over some of the foundational research that looked at PAHs and lung function health that kind of informed the progression towards respiratory protection. And now we'll look at a couple of phases of how respiratory protection was evaluated and some of the research behind it that led us to implementing it in the 2024 fire season. So the first phase just began with a wide swath looking at a bunch of different respirators on the market, buying them, sending them out to crews and collecting feedback. And then we quickly moved into the second phase, which was done last year, where we actually evaluated these respiratory protection models in the field, and we measured exposure to PAHs, largely because that methodology had already been established in previous research protocols, but also because you can measure it in the urine, so you can actually see the effect it has on absorption in the body, whereas many other hazards, you can really just assess the exposure in the air. And this study followed 85 participants across 6 different unit crews for 3 days each, and we looked at 3 different models. So on the left, the respirator is the Sunstrom SR100. This is a NIOSH certified elastomeric dual cartridge respirator. When you implement respiratory protection as an employer in a workplace, it really needs to be something that's certified by NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And the Sunstrom in this study was the only one that was certified by NIOSH. And then the 2 masks on the right, the Fair Air and the RZ, are masks that crews really liked, that were already using outside of the study potentially, that were lightweight, easy to wear, but they were not certified. But we included them anyway to see how all of these different models would respond. And unfortunately, the analyses are still currently underway, so we're not able to discuss how effective they were at reducing exposure to PAHs. But what we can talk about is what the crews thought of them and how they used them. So we let them keep their respirators for the remainder of the season, and under the condition that they provide information in a feedback survey. And what we found was that when you give someone a respirator and researchers aren't there, breathing down their necks, watching them, asking them to wear them as much as they can, we find that they will wear it for 15 to 30 minutes at a time, 2 to 3 times a day, for a total of like 1 to 2 hours per day. And I think this point is really, really important to really consider, because when you realize that that's the paradigm and that's the typical use case, a lot of models of respiratory protection may become a bit more amenable than what people might originally think. A lot of people would see a respirator and say, I can't wear that for a 16-hour shift, or I can't wear that for like a 90-minute hike. And absolutely that's true, and you shouldn't, because that can cause its own health and safety risks, physiological strain, heat stress, and things like that. But in reality, when we provide them a respirator as a tool, they will self-select when to use it, and they will use it for very targeted situations throughout the day. Most often they're wearing it during wet and dry mopping, which is understandable. That exposes them to smoke and ash and dust, and particularly ash and dust can be quite irritating on the throat. We see a positive impact as long as the work is relatively short-term and lightly physical, and we see a negative impact on communications in person and radio. Different models interfered with PPE in different ways, including the glasses, the face screen, the helmet, and the earmuffs. And 60% of respondents had facial hair that would interfere with the mask seal. And then interestingly, 100% of everyone that was included in the survey agreed that respiratory protection should be implemented within the BC Wildfire Service on a non-mandatory kind of discretionary basis. So this brings us to the models of respirators that we ended up going with, and we're providing 3 different models to our staff, starting with an N95. The N95 respirator fills a really important niche. It's something that's incredibly lightweight, it's easy to pack, it's disposable, you don't have to clean it, you don't have to maintain it, and you can communicate quite clearly through it. And so we think that this is going to play a really important role. The downside is that it only protects against particulates and not the gases in wildfire smoke, but it will protect against the particulate, and particularly during things like digging guard or dry mopping, when the overwhelming majority of what you're exposed to is just particulate anyway. We're also offering 2 different models of elastomeric respirators, the Quick Latch and the Secure Click. Both are manufactured by 3M. These fit a little bit differently. They have a little bit different mechanisms, so we wanted to provide people with multiple options. The Quick Latch, you can just flick a little click beneath your chin and it drops down into your face, which a lot of people liked for communication, drinking water, things like that. And then Secure Click is much more breathable. It's got easier filter attachments, a speech diaphragm in it, and a button that you can just press to do a seal check, which is something you need to do every time you wear a respirator. So there's a lot of quality of life features there. Most importantly is the enhanced breathability. If you're familiar with the hierarchy of controls, you will know that PPE is the very, very bottom. It's the least effective and should really be the last resort. And this is because there's a number of limitations. And that's true for respirators, and that's definitely true for respirators in a wildland firefighting environment. So first and foremost, a big limitation to respirator use is that there is no protection against carbon monoxide. You would need a respirator that supplies air to protect you against carbon monoxide, which is not feasible on the fireline. They are not quite feasible to wear in extremely physical and hot work environments, but the fireline can certainly be. That can preclude people from wearing respirators as much as they would like to or should, or it could completely outright prohibit respirator use during heat waves or very, very highly demanding tasks. Similarly, frequent in-person and radio communications may stop people from putting their respirator on or have them taking it off to communicate, which will expose them to the smoke and the ash and the dust. There's not the greatest ability to maintain a clean-shaven face, especially when individuals are line camping, which is when they camp out on the fire line. They don't go back to a fire camp. There are no flame-resistant respirator options at the moment on the market. There's very minimal space for additional packed gear, both in size of space and weight in the packs, that they're quite full. And a cartridge changeout schedule is unknown and can't really be established due to the variety in exposures and the variability in how often somebody may or may not wear their respirator. And so we rely on subjective assessments of, is it harder to breathe through, or odors penetrating it more, etc. There are other mitigation strategies to reduce overall exposure to wildfire smoke. I'll focus on the inhalation exposures and the all exposure route kind of sections of this table, and not so much the dermal exposure, as I think it'll just be a bit more, it'll pertain a bit more to this audience and the forestry industry. And don't feel like you need to read it all, because I will peel out all of the different sections of this table as I talk through the next few slides. So one of our first projects we're working on is something that we're calling a visual smoke density guide. And this is going to be a tool that will aid staff in making decisions regarding their exposures to smoke by establishing, visuals of what a typical smoky condition is, giving it a name, like is it light smoke, moderate smoke, or heavy smoke, and sort of coalescing everyone's opinion on what those categories are and what they look like. We'll also be able to pair the visuals with monitoring data that was taken when those pictures or videos were taken, and then we can bin these into risk categories with recommended actions regarding whether this is task rotation or respirator use, or maybe even establishing complete no-go zones. So it'll be like a document or a piece of media that'll essentially tell you, if it looks like this, you're exposed to this, whether that's carbon monoxide or particulate matter, and we recommend doing this, this, and this. And that could be limiting your time spent here to under an hour, or 2 hours if you're wearing a respirator, or not going at all. We're also looking at piloting a project to assess fire camp air quality this summer as well. We've procured a suite of air quality monitoring devices to be posted at smoke impacted camps. And there's kind of 2 goals. We want to look at what the off-shift exposure is for staff returning from a fire line who may be coming into a smoky camp. And we also want to assess the on-shift exposure among fire camp staff who work at the fire camp, who sleep and live and eat and recreate at the fire camp, and they never quite leave. Ultimately, the goal is to provide information and sort of a project outline for what could be real-time air monitoring data at all fire camps, and establishing trigger points which implement a tiered control system. So if there's this much particulate or carbon monoxide in the air, it is now a low or moderate risk fire camp, and we would trigger various controls like putting out N95s for staff to use, or conducting indoor air quality assessments in the trailers or things like that. We're also piloting 2 prototype clean air shelters. These were created this semester by students at the Wildland Polytechnic University Wilson School of Design. And the goal of these air shelters are to provide rest from wildfire smoke at staging areas and fire camps. And we are testing them this year at fire camps to assess basic practicality, functionality, durability, things like that. And we'll also be measuring the air quality at the camp, outside and inside these tents, to see how well they are performing. These are very early student designed prototypes, but something like this could be a potential engineering control that is deployed in the future at fire camps at certain trigger points identified by the real-time monitoring. Another huge study that we're getting off the ground this year is a partnership with the UBC Okanagan campus and researchers from the Center for Heart, Lung, and Vascular Health. And this looks to determine the cardiorespiratory impacts of wildfire smoke, ash, and dust, and over the course of 2 repeated seasons, which is a really much needed piece of information in the overall literature around health of wildland firefighting. We will be conducting pre, mid, and post-season monitoring that looks at blood, urine, sputum samples, lung and vascular function testing, ultrasounds, vitals, and more. And we'll also be conducting exposure assessments looking at the particulate matter from wildfire smoke and from silica exposure as well. So we're very excited to kind of be filling 2 huge gaps in the literature: repeated seasons, the effect of repeated seasons, and also looking at silica exposure as well. The last section of this presentation, and I know we're getting close on time, so I might just breeze through these last few slides, are something that the forestry industry at large can look to as guidance for how you can be proactive and deal with wildfire smoke and protect your employees. And really, we should be looking towards some proactive jurisdictions on the West Coast in the States, so Washington, Oregon, and California, which all have implemented permanent new regulations that apply to all employers in these states, other than those that have employees specifically in enclosed buildings and vehicles with air filtration and wildland firefighting. And it's based on the EPA Air Quality Index, and essentially employers must monitor PM 2.5 forecasts and implement training, controls, and respirators as the air quality index progressively worsens. So this is the air quality index here. And these are the Washington smoke regulations. These are the newest regulations. They take into account what Oregon and California has done. And this is likely the best jurisdiction to look to for guidance. I won't go through all of these just in the sake of time. And so what this means for you as an employer, as an employee, this means this is where you should be looking if you want to be proactive. They are our neighboring jurisdictions to our south. They are dealing with the same wildfire smoke we are, and they have implemented these regulations. They're permanent regulations and they apply to everyone. So it's potentially possible that this could be the future for British Columbia, and you can kind of get ahead of it by looking to these regulations as guidance and begin implementing your own practices as well. Along this line, something I'd like to just plug is a wildfire smoke app. This is actually based on the Washington state regulations. So it's really great to use. It was created by IATSE 891 and Aura Health and Safety. It was created for the film industry, but it's completely applicable anywhere. It's based on those Washington regulations, and it uses your phone to incorporate, like, geolocates on your phone what your local AQI readings are, and then it spits out a risk category along with what, according to the Washington regulations, you need to do as an employer or an employee. So it's free. It's available on the App Store and Google Play. It's a really great app, and I encourage people to look into that and see how they can kind of fit it into their own health and safety programming. And then these are just some links. If these slides are made available, you can feel free to click through them. There's some resources, and we can also make sure to put these in the description of the YouTube video once this is posted as well. So that is my presentation. I know it was a lot of information, so if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat now. Otherwise, I left my email on the screen as well, and I'd be more than happy to chat and have a discussion over email or call or whatever. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me, and I'm excited to hear from the audience.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Lots of great information there. We did have a couple of questions, a few questions from the audience. First one is, has there been any history of carbon monoxide poisoning incidents during wildland firefighter not related to vehicle or engine emissions?
The answer is undoubtedly yes. But but the interesting thing about carbon monoxide exposure is it looks like a whole lot of other things. So symptoms include headaches, nausea, fatigue, and these sorts of characteristics are often found in the wildfire environment. So undoubtedly, people have suffered from carbon monoxide exposure, not related specifically to being beside a pump, but very difficult to categorize as such. Certainly last year, we did have 2 known events where people were exposed directly to, like they were working in a sump kind of area with a Mark III in a low-lying area and did suffer from carbon monoxide very clearly exposure. So, but again, that's more related to operating next to a machine or a 2-stroke engine, and that's part of the research that Drew also did for us. Yeah.
Another one around PM 2.5. If there's no exposure limit to PM 2.5, what would be the 8-hour exposure that would result in a 0.5 hazard ratio?
Yeah, so to get a hazard ratio, you do need to have an exposure limit to work from. You have 2 options. Something you can work from is I don't really want to call it an option because it's definitely not what you should do, but what people tend to do is use the particulates not otherwise classified exposure limit that we have one in British Columbia. However, this is just for particulates that are specifically not toxic, and it's just about like lung overload. And if you adjusted that to a 12 to 16-hour work shift, you would get 0.75 or 750 micrograms per meters cubed. So half of that would be 375. So you could use that. Alternatively, you could use what the National Wildfire Coordinating Group is using as an interim working OEL of 700. If you notice, those are very, very similar, which is kind of one of the reasons why I am a bit suspicious of that working OEL being protective when it is essentially just the particles not otherwise classified limit. And that would be 350 micrograms per meters cubed would be half of that. So again, you'd want to be aiming that 95% of exposures are below 0.5. So 1 in 20, only 1 in 20 can be above that. You don't want to use like averages if you do have monitoring data, because if you use an average to compare, you're accepting that roughly half of the exposures can be above it. So yeah, I think best case scenario without a great exposure limit, about 350 micrograms per meters cubed would be an action limit for the working OEL that we're using.
Lots of questions here about the slides being available. I know that we'll post the presentation on our YouTube channel, but is there an opportunity for us to share the slides with your links and things in there? And I know you have a slide after this one. I think there was certainly some interest in where people can find more information if they're for fire and fire science. So are we able to share these things on our website, for example?
Certainly, yeah. I will send you my slide deck, but yeah, I'll definitely get a file to you and you can post it for sure.
Was that PAH biomonitoring study been published yet?
So 2 of them have. The ones that were conducted in 2019 and 2021 have been published. You want to look for, the lead author was Cherry, Cherry. And there'll also be, once these are posted, they are in the references list. The one that we evaluated, the 3 different types of respirators in 2023, has not been published yet. I think it will be published soon. I don't want to give like any rough timeline, but certainly this year it will be published.
So a note that IATSE has a Humidex app as well, so I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, very similar to the wildfire app in like form and functionality. It might be a little less applicable because they have options for different like clothing options that may or may not apply to wildland firefighting or the forestry industry, but it's also a great resource. And if you're looking for an easy way to incorporate the Humidex and a heat stress risk assessment, I would highly recommend that app as well.
Another question that came in is around taking breaks in a vehicle and air conditioning and the vehicle itself. What does that have any impact on exposure, or is it overwhelmed?
I would say we haven't done any research in terms of like putting recirc on closing the doors and monitoring air in a truck versus the air outside of it. I think it would be better than standing outside, but the cabin filters are not going to be like MERV 13, 14, 15, like rated filters that you would need to really filter out the small particles in wildfire smoke. That being said, it's probably better than nothing. It won't filter out carbon monoxide, so you'll still be exposed to carbon monoxide and potentially under the effects of carbon monoxide. It would be much better to try to get to an area where there's no wildfire smoke, but that can be incredibly difficult.
And how have you, like people who smoke and vape, is there any info on how this affects their response to wildfire smoke?
They will be, I wouldn't say that I am like an expert in this field, but to my understanding, they are at increased risk. Just purely from like a numbers standpoint, they are being exposed to more particulate matter, PAHs, etc. in the smoke in cigarettes versus wildfire smoke. One area where they may be less at risk in terms of some symptoms are their bodies seem to be better at dealing with carbon monoxide or low levels of carbon monoxide, because if they smoke, they constantly have a small percent of carboxyhemoglobin in their blood. That's my understanding. But otherwise, the kind of risk assessment communication that I use with smokers is you are increasing your risk. It's like an additive effect. I don't think there's any reason to think it may be synergistic. Like I believe asbestos in smoking is synergistic. It's kind of like multiplicative, but you're certainly adding on to the burden in your body if you're smoking and you're exposed to wildfire smoke.
Thank you. Another question about aviation fuel, and is there lots of work around aircraft in your world? Any monitoring being done there?
We don't have any plans to at the moment. I know that helicopter exhaust can be a significant portion of carbon monoxide, but I mean, Steve might be better to answer this. Like to my understanding, like just the time spent versus exposed to that exhaust or versus like other sources of engine exhaust or wildfire smoke, it's just not like nearly as high of a priority for monitoring.
Yeah, certainly one of the areas, Richard, that we saw a really high exposure to carbon monoxide and is like water tender drivers who are backing up into a ladder, unloading a tank of water while the engine is running. Like scenarios like that, certainly would impact this audience quite a bit. But like we saw very high exposures during that type of work as well as the chainsaw operating and pump operating. So working directly with water tenders or heavy machinery certainly is a potential.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are coming to the end of our time here. Are you able to show the app again? There's been a few questions about that. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so thank you both for your presentation, and thanks everyone in the audience for joining us. It's been very informative, and I see a bunch of responses to say thank you for this opportunity as well in the chat as well. So thank you very much. Very interesting, and best of good luck and best in the fire season. It's yeah, I know it's already starting, and you guys will be busy. So thank you very much, and have an excellent afternoon.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, really happy to be able to go over this information. So thanks for attending to the audience, and Richard, Alice and Sue, yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.